Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We would like to present our study entitled The Effects of Formative Assessment on EFL Young Learners' Speaking Performances, Perspective from Teachers. Our presentation is divided into 6 parts. The first one is the statement of the problem. The next is literature review. Number 3 is research methodology. Part 4 will focus on major findings and discussions. Implications is included in part 5, and the last is references. Formative assessment is believed to be beneficial to the language learners. Black and Williams, 1998, stated that formative assessment enhances learning and can raise standards of achievement for all students. Despite its importance, most of related studies on formative assessment have been conducted in countries whose teaching context is different from Vietnam. In addition, National Education Program 2018 had been launched in Vietnam, in which formative assessment is expected to be more influential on students' language competencies. That is the reason why we would like to investigate the effects of formative assessment on EFL young learners' speaking performances, with an aim to identify and evaluate what constitute best practices in formative assessment and find ways to effectively support such practices. Formative assessment is conducted in relation with different learning paradigms. JICE 2009 point out that awareness of implicit views of learning is important for the learning environment one wants to develop in schools and for aligning teaching and assessment to the intentions in the curriculum. Different learning perspectives such as behaviorist, cognitive, and social views of learning will serve as a basis for discussing how formative assessment can be grounded in theory. A great number of studies have been conducted on the effects of formative assessment on students' language competencies. We may focus on benefit of formative assessment for improving teaching and learning. Other researchers were more interested in the actual implementation of formative assessment in classroom, such as Black and William, 1998, Gettulo, 2000, etc. Let's see what is meant by formative assessment. Black and William, 1988, defined formative assessment is on those activities undertaken by teachers and or their students to modify teaching and learning activities in which they are engaged. Gettulo, 2000, characterized formative assessment as an ongoing multi-phase process that is carried out on a daily basis through teacher-pupil interaction. Formative assessment provides feedback for immediate action, and formative assessment aims at modifying teaching activities in order to improve learning processes and results. Another question arising here is, why is formative assessment important? Researchers on formative assessment find out that formative assessment aims to support learning, to adapt, modify, and direct instruction, to make decisions intended to improve unsuccessful yet still modifiable instruction. Formative assessment is also used immediately to make adjustments so as to form new learning or to help low achievers more than other students, and so reduces the range of achievement while raising achievement overall. Our study set out to answer 3 research questions. Question number 1, What are EFL teachers' perception of formative assessment? Question 2. What are EFL teachers' actual practices of formal assessment in their classes at primary school? Question 3. Are there any correlations between teachers' perception and actual practices of formative assessment and student speaking performances? If yes, what? From September through December 2019, researchers collected data in different schools in Nguyen using a variety of quantitative and qualitative methods, administering surveys of 182 EFL teachers on their formative assessment, perception, and practices, interviewing 30 teachers to see firsthand their formative assessment practices. Using these data, our study sought to add to the teachers' understanding by answering those questions about formative assessment. The survey questionnaire is a 5-point Likert scale design consisting of 40 items divided into 5 groups of variables. The first group aims at EFL teachers' perception on formative assessment. The second one investigates EFL teachers' actual practices of formative assessment at primary schools. Data on the influence of formative assessment in EFL classes were reflected via 11 items. The fourth group involved the effects of formative assessment on EFL young learner speaking performances, and the last questions try to find out if there are any advantages and disadvantages when teachers conduct formative assessment in their classes. The interview is semi-structured with suggested ideas about the focus of assessment, like the student efforts, fluency or pronunciation, or the methods and techniques teachers use in their classes. For example, any in-class activities, how to give feedback, praise, or SEL and peer assessment, etc. After collecting data from the survey questionnaire, we use software SPSS 20 to analyze data, and here are some basic findings in our study. The first one is teachers' perception on formative assessment. Most of the respondents were well aware that formative assessment is a useful and formative teaching tool to realize student weakness and strength. Formative assessment is also used to assess student learning progress and to develop student competencies. We also need to identify and elevate what constitutes best practices in formative assessment and find ways to effectively support such practices. Teachers' actual practices of formative assessment have been illustrated with data from survey questionnaire and semi-structured interview. Although teachers can use any form of assessment as a formative assessment, the key to formative assessment is how and when that information will be used. When teachers use formative assessment, they are more likely to see gains in student achievement, especially among low-performing students. So they focus much on student speaking performances like fluency or ideas. Formative assessment is also considered as a part of daily teaching practice, not an occasional classroom event. So formative assessment were conducted within lessons and instructional units to provide teacher and student with more immediate information about student learning and have a more direct impact on improving student achievement. Teachers use a variety of strategies in the classroom to formally assess student progress, including clarifying and sharing learning goals, engineering effective classroom discussion, providing regular feedback, supporting students as driver of their own learning, and instructional resources for one another. When effectively implemented, formative assessment practices such as classroom discussion, descriptive feedback, and the development of sound peer assessment skill yield large and consistent achievement gains. We have found out that our students are more interested in English. Students are more involved in English lessons, and the learning environment is much improved. And when teachers actively use formative assessment, they facilitate students' learning progressions and better ways of performing their speaking competencies. Pronunciation is the most improved. Fluency as a second, content and vocabulary are equally noticed, and grammar is the least affected with the use of formative assessment. Why DOET play a key leadership role? Teachers say that they receive their best support and resources focused at the school level from school manager, instructional leaders, and the peers. Teachers regularly use some type of formative assessment strategies, but the implementation of their practice is uneven. Although teachers use some strategy effectively, on the whole, most teachers need more practice and support to improve their implementation, particularly in areas that invite more student participation and ownership of their learning, because some of them are reluctant to involve in the lesson. And we also found that most teachers have a limited repertoire when it comes to formative assessment strategies, and the current tools and training provided are not sufficient. That is the reason why they find themselves not confident enough. And to evaluate the correlation between teachers' perception and the young learners' speaking performances, we have calculated the correlation coefficient value between them. The significant value of the test is less than 0.05, so it can be confirmed that the linear correlation coefficient values between the two factors are statistically significant. The correlation coefficient between the two factors are equal 0.4.7, so we can conclude that teachers' perception on formative assessment have a positive correlation with students' speaking performances with a relatively strong correlation. And if the values of teachers' perception increases, the value of students' speaking performances increases, and vice versa. And to evaluate the correlation between teachers' actual practices and students' speaking performances, we have calculated the correlation coefficient value between them. The significant value of the test is less than 0.05, so it can be confirmed that the linear correlation coefficient values between the two factors are statistically significant. The correlation coefficient between the two factors is equal 0.88, so we can conclude that teachers' actual practices of formative assessment have a positive correlation with students' speaking performances with a relatively strong correlation. And if the values of teachers' actual practices of formative assessment increases, the value of students' speaking performances increases, and vice versa. In brief, 3 research questions put forward have been successfully answered. Research question number 1, teachers are well aware of the role and importance of formative assessment, especially for the improvement of teaching and learning process. Research question number 2, teachers regularly use some type of formative assessment strategies, but the implementation of their practice is uneven. Although teachers use some strategy effectively on the whole, most teachers need more practice and support to improve their implementation, particularly in areas that invite more student participation and ownership of their learning. Research question 3, formative assessment has been claimed to be efficient to young learners' English competencies in general, and speaking performances in particular. From the correlation among these factors, it can be concluded that if teachers have positive perceptions and good practices of formative assessment, student speaking performances will accordingly be improved, and vice versa. Findings about current teaching and learning context at primary school in Nghệ An province will suggest that the following paradigms of classroom formative assessment proposed by OECD can be applied in classroom. Firstly, establish a classroom culture that encourages interaction and the use of assessment tools. Secondly, establish the learning goals and track individual student progress toward those goals. Thirdly, use varied instruction methods to meet diverse student needs. Fourthly, use varied approaches to accessing student understanding. Number 5, provide feedback on student performance and adaptation of the instruction to meet identified needs. And number 6, promote active involvement of students in the learning process. Black and Williams, 1998, also suggested that formative assessment could be improved by helping learners understand exactly what they have to do in order to succeed, encouraging productive classroom discussion, including sufficient thinking time, embedded opportunity for all learners to express their understanding, providing feedback that helps students to move on in their learning and avoids comparison with other learners, then giving them the opportunity to act on that feedback, and training learners in self-assessment and providing opportunities for them to be learning resources for others. And here are some references for our studies. That is the end of our presentation. Thank you for listening.